I tell you what, we're back in Genesis now. And we're going to get back into our series here a little bit. Before I do a couple things, get this turned on, away we go. Betty, I'd like to get the phone number for Cynthia. I want to call her and encourage her this week. Sounds like she's had similar little issues that I've had in the past. So, okay, thank you. I appreciate that. And secondly, we've probably got the best historian in Indiana teaching our Sunday school. Oh, it's the best kept secret, I know, but after the service this morning, you ought to traipse down and enjoy Sunday school with this young man. Yeah, it's a young man. Compared to me, he's a young man. So I just wanted to remind you of that. It's always wonderful, and I learn something every week. But we're getting back into the series after Easter now, and we come to the history of Joseph, which is where Genesis takes an unexpected and kind of a troubling turn. Up to this point, we've seen some characters go through some difficult times, but you can't say they didn't earn every minute of it. In fact, you can say they got off easier than they deserved. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Oh my. They made some boneheaded decisions, didn't they? They were stubborn. They were rebellious moves. Each paid a bit of a price for it. And you can also see that for them, the bread kept landing butter side up for them. Every time. It seemed every time. God was patient with each and every one of them again and again and again until they finally came around and got serious about living for God. So this morning we're going to go over to Genesis chapter 37 as we get rolling today. So get your swords out and get turned over there to 37. And so now today we get to Joseph. Now if you're keeping score, Joseph, well, he's better than the other leading characters in Genesis because he has, more character, more resolve, more faithfulness, you might say, maybe more integrity, if I could use that word. In fact, you can only fault Joseph for one thing, and I'll get to that in a little while here today. In our last walk through the book of Genesis, the historical account, and I'll get us caught up to speed here very quickly, we had Jacob returning to the land of Canaan, the home of his father Isaac, his grandfather Abraham. He made peace with his brother Esau, as you might remember. And then he built an altar there to worship God, who he realizes now he'd been with him all the way. Now, shortly after this, his wife Rebekah gives birth to Benjamin, Jacob's 12th son. It was a hard labor for Rebekah. She did not survive the labor. And as you remember, she was Jacob's favorite. And Jacob built a stone monument in her memory. And Jacob, he kind of got it honest, but he had this tendency to play favorites with his sons. And Joseph, who was now a teenager, was his chosen favorite. Let's go to God's word now. And we'll start with Genesis 37, verse 3. Let's go. Now Israel loved Joseph more than his other sons because Joseph was a son born to him in his old age. And he made a long-sleeved robe for him. When his brothers saw that their father loved him more than all his brothers, they hated him and could not bring themselves to speak peaceably to him. Now Joseph, he had a dream one night. Dreams play a big role in Joseph's life, by the way. When he told his brothers the dream, man, they hated him even more. And this is what he told them about his dream. Verse 7. We were out in the field, tying up bundles of grain. Suddenly my bundle stood up, and your bundles all gathered round and bowed low before mine. And his brothers responded, so you think you will be our king, do you? Do you actually think you'll reign over us? And they hated him all the more because of his dreams and the way he talked about them. But then he had another dream, and he told his brothers about this one too. He said that the sun and the moon and 11 stars, coincidentally the same number of brothers he had, bowed before me, he said. And he also told his father Jacob about the dream. And his father Jacob said, are you saying that your mother and your brothers and I will all bow down to you? His brothers hated him more than ever. But Jacob did pause and ponder what was going on there. Now, I said earlier Joseph didn't really do anything wrong, but this was his one mistake, I feel. Probably should have kept them dreams to himself. He was antagonizing his brothers by telling them that they would be his servants. And by the way, spoiler alert, it happened several years down the road. Finally, Joseph's brothers said, this is enough. We have had enough of this kid. And by the way, he also had a habit of reporting back to his father anything that they might have done that was a little amiss. You know, he was kind of a squealer. So they put a plan in place to kill him. And this is hard to imagine, but it's a recurring theme in the book of Genesis. Brothers seeking to kill brothers. It happened with Cain and Abel. Esau wanted to kill Jacob. And now several of Jacob's sons were ready to give Joseph a dirt nap. The plan was to kill him, throw him into a cistern, a deep water tank, and tell Jacob that he was attacked by wild animals. They said, this will put an end to those dreams. His brother Reuben, it's where my favorite sandwich comes from. He came to his defense, sort of. He said, we don't really need to actually kill him. Let's just throw him into this water tank. Let's throw him into this cistern. In time, he'll die on his own. Now, here's what Reuben was thinking. Later, I'm going to go back and rescue this kid. So the brothers took Joseph's fancy robe. Apparently, he wore that crazy thing, that Technicolor dream coat. He wore that everywhere. They took that robe off of him and threw a bunch of blood on it from some animal. Told Dad what happened. But before they did that, they saw some Ishmaelites coming down the road, some Arabs. And old Judah, being the entrepreneur that he was, he says, you know what? We could make a little money here. So they pulled Joseph from the well and they said to him, good news, little brother. We're not leaving you here to die. Instead, we're gonna let you go with these guys. And for 20 shekels of silver, they sold him. Took that colorful coat all messed up with animal blood, goat blood. And Jacob, the father, he was brokenhearted. Of course. So what happens to Joseph? Ishmaelites take him into Egypt. He was sold to a high-ranking government official named Potiphar. Let's move ahead now to chapter 39. First verse. Now Joseph had been taken to Egypt. An Egyptian named Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh and the captain of the guards, brought him from the Ishmaelites who had brought him there. The Lord was with Joseph, and he became a successful man, serving in the household of his Egyptian master. When his master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord made everything he did successful, Joseph found favor with his master and became his personal attendant. Potiphar also put him in charge of his household and placed all that he owned under his authority. So the Bible says that Potiphar, he didn't have to worry about anything except for what he was going to eat that day. But really there was something else that Potiphar needed to be concerned about. And that was his wife. Verse 6. Now Joseph was well built and handsome. After some time, his master's wife looked longingly at Joseph and said, "Sleep with me." But Joseph refused her advances, saying that Potiphar had been good to him, put his trust in him. And we see in verse 9, he says, "So how could I do this immense evil? And how could I sin against God?" Well, Mrs. Potiphar wouldn't take no for an answer. She tried again and again. He did everything he could to avoid her, but she just wouldn't give up. And one day when she grabbed him, she tore himself away from her and ran from the house, but a piece of that cloak got torn off. And later when her husband came home, she said, look at verse 17 now. "The Hebrew slave you brought to us came to make a fool of me. But when I screamed for help, he left his garment beside me and ran outside." Well, I imagine that Potiphar was pretty upset about that. He was enraged. He wasted no time in throwing Joseph into prison where all the king's prisoners were held. So here we are. Once again, through no fault of his own, Joseph is on the receiving end of some of the most inhumane treatment imaginable. Tossed aside by his brothers, sold into slavery, and then now wrongfully accused of the worst kind of wrongdoing. He didn't deserve it, but the prisoner doors slammed shut. Now the story doesn't end there, and I'm sure most of you already are aware of this, but for today, I want to stop it right there. It's about where the story's going to end today, because I want you to feel for just a little bit Joseph's pain. The injustice, the betrayal, and the feelings of abandonment. This isn't where the story ends. But if you were in Joseph's sandals, if he even had them at that time, you might have thought, like he, that was probably going to be it. Maybe Joseph thought that this was the final chapter of his all too short life. Let's bring it to today. Folks, we live in a world where good things happen to good people. That's what we want, isn't it? That's what we want. We want to live in a world where good things happen to good people. Of course, we can even accept that sometimes good things happen to bad people. But why would such a terrible thing happen to someone so good? It isn't fair. It isn't right. Where was God? Why did he let it happen? Why didn't he stop it? Tell you, as much as I'd like to answer those last two questions, I can't. And no one can. We live in a fallen world where sin has a mighty stronghold in the hearts of many, and sometimes injustice reigns, at least for a season. The Bible promises that there will come a day when all wrongs will be made right and justice will prevail. Now, in some situations today, we're able to see justice being meted out properly once in a while. Once in a while, we see that with our own eyes. But other times, we're left waiting until that day when God sets everything right. So as Joseph deteriorates in that prison cell, I don't believe he knew how the events of his life would play out. I don't think he had any kind of foreknowledge at all. But I do believe that Joseph found strength in his most fundamental beliefs about what it means to walk with God. So today, in the little bit of time that I've got remaining, I want to take a look at these three fundamental beliefs that sustained Joseph through those tough days. Perhaps the most difficult days of his life. I certainly think they were. And as they sustained Joseph, I think if we glom onto these three, they're going to help us through as well. Number one, it's better to pay the price for doing good than to be rewarded for doing wrong. Boy, wouldn't that be nice if Washington would see that? But it's better to be punished for good behavior than to be praised for bad behavior. The culture we live in today, boy, doesn't it confuse the two? My, oh my. If Joseph had been willing to do what is wrong, he might have gained favor with a very powerful woman. Perhaps it would have helped his career in one way or another. Might have helped his bank account. But he refused to play that game. He refused to take that risk. And the result was that Joseph paid the price for doing good. And here's the catch today. He paid the same price that so many who seek to do good have paid through the years. When the enemy targets believers with the intention of taking them down, the enemy's strategy is, how do I discredit this person? How can I distort the truth? How can I fabricate details to destroy their reputation? Now, you can see this today in the political world where the rule of Satan is easily exposed to anyone who is discerning. Wrongful accusation, one after the other. It's the lifeblood of the oppressive movement. It is the lifeblood of the progressive movement because it keeps you living in fear. And this is the question then. What if the mob comes after me? This is why Jesus has encouraged us to remember. Blessed are you when people insult you, persecute you, and falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me. Rejoice and be glad, because great is your reward in heaven. For in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you. Watchman Nee, one of the greatest Christian leaders of the last century. From the 1920s to the 1950s, he traveled throughout China, winning converts to Christ, discipling new believers, planting churches. He was all over the place. But then he fell into disfavor with the Chinese Communist Party, and they came after him. Now let me ask you, was he arrested for being like Jesus? Was he arrested for helping people? Nope. Like many Christian workers in China, back then and since, He was charged with a number of unlikely crimes: bribery, tax evasion, theft of government information. He was sent to prison. He spent the last 20 years of his life in prison. History repeats itself, doesn't it, Scott? The perspective of history allows us to see through our own political witch hunts and even the deceitful actions of the Chinese Communist Party. But today, all over the world, there are many who are falsely accused, and they're never vindicated. Joseph could have died in prison, with everybody thinking that he did the worst kind of evil. But he would rather pay the price for doing right than be rewarded for doing wrong. This is one reason why this story about Joseph is so relevant today. Number two, even when a situation seems out of control, God still controls the current. Boy, we need to remember that. You know, sometimes God will say, in effect, you know, I want you to pack your bags and I want you to go to this new place, like he did with Abraham. And sometimes God will allow the circumstances of the situation to move you where you need to be. There were many reasons why Joseph needed to be in Egypt. And we'll see this next week, and I don't want to, spoil that story. It had to do with a worldwide famine that was on its way. And God knew that. And God used the circumstances to lead Joseph to where he needed to be. But here's the thing, and I want to be very clear on this. God did not create the crisis in Joseph's life. You hear me? When Joseph's brothers sold him into slavery, when Potiphar's wife brought a false allegation, God's response to them was not, hey, well done, thou good and faithful servant. No. He was in no way pleased with them. In no way. God did not create the crisis in Joseph's life. But God was able to control it. And it's the same for you. You may have been victimized at some point in your life. You may have been wrongfully accused at some point in your life. You may have been taken advantage of in some point in your life. You may have been cheated. You may have been bullied. And on and on. And I want you to know that God did not create whatever crisis you may be facing today. He didn't make it. But He can control it. He can work through it. He didn't cause this situation, but He can certainly redeem it. Now, a verse many of you know by heart. We know that all things work together for the good of those who love God, who are called according to His purpose. I know that is a very hard verse at some points in our lives. I know. But it is a true statement. God never gives up on you. If circumstances are going against you, I tell you what, don't go whining under a broom tree somewhere. Don't give in to the temptation to shake your fist and blame God for everything you don't like about your life. Now, He's a big boy. He can take it. But He didn't do it. And He can surely make it right. He can control the situation. He can redeem your suffering, even now. So as we think back, and here's Joseph languishing in prison, not sure of what might happen next, he knew that God wasn't to blame. He knew that. And even though the situation seemed completely out of control, he knew that God was still in the mix and was going to work it out. And I tell you, that's some faith. We need that. Now, here's the third fundamental belief that sustained Joseph through his most difficult days before we go down into our Sunday school class today. And here it is. No amount, get this, no amount of injustice can separate you from God's favor. I tell you, He loves you. Dear Christian, He wants the very best for you. You would think that this story ends right here. He's done. He's in prison. The prison doors, the dungeon is slammed shut. Joseph is going to face the rest of his life in a musty, stinking, wet, underground cell. It's almost where the story ends, but not quite. Here he is in the most terrible situation. But what happens? Look with me now. Let's continue in God's Word. Verse 21. But the Lord was with Joseph and extended kindness to him. He granted him favor with the prison warden. The warden put all the prisoners who were in the prison under Joseph's authority. And he was responsible for everything that was done there. The warden did not bother with anything under Joseph's authority because the Lord was with him. And the Lord made everything that he did successful. Now, folks, you've heard of people that can't win for losing. Every break they get somehow turns bad. I tell you what, Joseph is exactly the opposite. He can't lose for winning. A situation goes bad and he still manages to rise to the top. And after a while, it's pretty clear why this keeps happening. It's because God is with Joseph, and Joseph is with God. He remains faithful. No matter what comes his way, he remains faithful. He's faithful when his father honors him with a brightly colored robe. He is faithful when he's sold into slavery and loaded onto a caravan. He is faithful when he becomes the top administrator in Potiphar's little regime. And he's faithful when he's unjustly accused by a spiteful woman and thrown into a prison. At any point, he could have compromised his beliefs, his principles. But he remained faithful. So that even in prison, where he would surely spend the rest of his life, he experienced God's favor. My friends, this morning as I wrap this all up and kind of boil it down and skim off the top a little bit, there's no dark that is too dark for the light of God to find you. There's no mistreatment that you can endure. No injustice that can come your way that will separate you from God's favor. He loves you. Wherever you are today, God's favor can find you. And He can bless you in the midst of the most unseemly situations that you might find yourself in. God is the one who controls the current of your life. The enemy, and they're always there. They can create one crisis after another, and situations may appear to be spinning into chaos. But God still controls the current. He didn't create the crisis you face, but He certainly has the power to redeem it. So continue to trust in Him. Stay faithful to Him. And while God is at work redeeming your individual situation, as only He can, you can be sure that His favor will be with you, that His love will be with you, that He will bless you right where you are, even in the midst of a mess. So life, even at its worst, cannot separate you from the love of God in Jesus Christ. And that's this portion in a little nutshell today. We'll continue on with this young man in prison starting next week. But let's stand to the Lord, for the Lord this morning. I I just want to pray with you. Maybe there's some things that